captioning. And if y'all are so enamored with us and want to give us some money, we hope to have some other kind of like closed captioning features in the future. But in the meantime, this is like kind of the best accommodation we're able to provide, and we'll be sticking to the script mostly and sharing any questions that we get throughout the presentation in the chat. And then also, this event is going to be simulcasted with some of our friends at Not Safe for Wonks. And so they're sharing it off to their YouTube page and some of their other media projects. And so in case they will be having, the thing full screen, so their name shouldn't be really too like accessible to the people who are watching it on YouTube per se. But if you have any, sort of worry safety wise, just feel free to, turn off your camera or use an alias for your Zoom name. So to get back to the intro, A World Without Police really came out of a group in Houston from late 2014 and 2016 called Out of the Flames of Ferguson, a multiracial but majority Black group of young radicals disillusioned with calls for reform and respectability politics of some older generation organizers. Out of the Flames organized events, protests, and a defense campaign for a survivor of police brutality, which was the Justice for Brittany campaign. In New York City, people had been involved in the mass street protests and disruptions around the murders of Mike Brown and Eric Garner. And in the meantime, while those solidarity protests had been blowing up, we were, there was a lot of movement as well for abolitionists. So being here in Atlanta, there was definitely a need for a chapter and kind of like an abolitionist front. So A World Without Police kind of emerged in late 2016 when some people with some experience doing anti-police and prison work for a few years, and some people who were kind of freshly into the scene came together to discuss building a local police abolition pole in the city. Like everywhere, people were disillusioned with the calls for reform, and we wanted to meet those people to push our perspective. Out of our experiences with the 2013 to 2016 movement for Black Lives Matter wave, similar questions were coming up. How can we deal with the big nonprofits and the establishment left who tend to have a conservatizing effect on street protests? How can we break through shallow calls for police reform and connect with others around an explicitly abolitionist politics? We wanted to help cohere police abolitionist movement, anti-racist, anti-capitalist pole out of the disparate groups that had taken up perspectives and practical work in their own cities, but hadn't really linked up or coordinated a broader presence beyond the local level. So what we're doing now, we're currently running a website project called worldwithoutpolice.org, where we publish reports from groups in other cities doing police abolition work, push strategy coming from around the nation, provide resources for those interested in exploring police abolition, and write analysis of current events concerning police. In the past, we've coordinated strategy calls, for instance, with friends in Minneapolis, where a police precinct was occupied for 18 days in protest of the murder of Jamar Clark, and with folks in New York City who are organizing anti-deportation support by connecting churches and other sanctuary spaces to be able to defend against ICE raids. In parallel with that, we've attended book fairs and speaking events to connect people around the US doing similar work and support people trying to support and trying to start up police abolition networks in their cities by sharing resources and more. Summer 2016, we toured around the South, going to Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Atlanta, Nashville, Durham, Asheville, Baton Rouge, and other cities, also with the same hope of kind of connecting the broader abolition movement. And locally, we've helped facilitate organizer trainings, protest trainings, discussion groups, and put on other kinds of educational events about abolition. On the organizer training, we're also going to be having our kind of like 2021 organizer training coming up in about 2 weeks on the 24th. And so, yeah, definitely please keep your eyes out for a flyer from us. You will definitely find it on our social media, but also I'm sure it'll make its rounds with other solidarity groups that we work with. And to bring the struggle back to Atlanta, starting in 2017, we worked on a campaign to permanently close ACDC, the Atlanta City Detention Center, the downtown city jail that detains people picked up on crimes of poverty and homelessness, and detained immigrants through a program paid for by ICE, which was 287G. We were heavily involved with this campaign for over a year, working among a coalition pushing both to permanently close the jail and to get the city to break their contract with ICE that allowed the jail to be used for immigrant detention. After a days-long occupation outside of the jail in 2018, the city agreed to stop using the jail for immigration detention. Another local organization called Women on the Rise, as well as other orgs in the larger coalition, were involved in attending city council meetings where they're able to get an agreement with the city to shut down ACDC and potentially repurpose it as a social center. At the time, it seemed like a huge success and was celebrated as a monumental win for Atlanta activism. However, although the jail has drastically dropped in population, over the summer, we saw the city use it to detain protesters from the George Floyd uprising. And we know now that the city has almost basically abandoned their pledge to shut down ACDC. It's been renamed as the Atlanta City Pretrial Detention Center, and it's been indefinitely like full intention of maintaining its use. On that, currently the Fulton County Sheriff has just submitted another proposal, which has been, like an aspiration of his for the last almost decade, to try to purchase it, for the Fulton County to purchase it from the city of Atlanta and, purpose it for their currently overcrowded jail system that's been overcrowded since 2006. Despite their existing PAD and the issuing of signature bonds within PAD is the pre-reverse diversion program here in Atlanta, and the use of signature bonds being like kind of an attempt at change to get people out of pretrial detention. So this winter, since the George Floyd uprising has slowed, at least for now, we are using the time to regroup, strategize, and recruit people to come organize with us. We're having an organizer training, like I mentioned, on January 24th. And so if you're interested in joining up with the World Without Police, you should attend the training. And we'll maybe bring up some more topics on it at the end. This presentation is, the format's gonna be first kind of a brief history of the origins of police, then how the 20th century police reform leads into policing today, some defining characteristics of policing today, handling the question of reform and the question of abolition, and then some ideas about the way forward: disempower, disarm, disband, and some time for discussion. With that, let me move over to the next slide and I'll toss it over to B. Oh, that's not where we're going.
Hey B, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. In the spirit of knowing where you've been to inform where you're going, I will be discussing the origins of police. But before I begin, I would like to pose a question to the group. What do you know about the origins of police already? Open question, anyone feel free to answer. Well, that's okay. I'm going to ask several questions of the group as this goes on. Do not feel compelled to answer. Oh, there we go. That's a big part of it. So that gets me to where we're going to go. But let's get started. So let's discuss the history of the police, some aspects of policing today, and their overall role in a capitalist society. Their role is to maintain capitalist inequality. And in all of the forms that we experience that. And I'm talking about property in terms of race, gender, and so much more. There are a force used to discipline the population to and defend the inequalities we live through. In this role, policing always requires the threat and use of violence. Move on to our next slide. You see this in the history of the police. To be clear, we're going to focus more on its origins in the United States, where the police emerged out of the institution of slavery and in the capitalist development of the United States. Starting in the 1700s through the early 1800s, a time of intense social disintegration and recomposition. Can anyone in this group think of any examples of what's going on during that time period in the Americas? I'll get some time for those answers to be populated either through chat or feel free to raise your hand and speak up. Can you think of any examples of what's going on during this time period? And I'm speaking specifically of the 1700s through the early 1800s.
Part of it, I would say, is probably industrialization of a lot of factories and factory workers.
Absolutely. Well, I'll forge ahead. Specifically, I would like to talk about the intense looting of the Americas, the slaughter of indigenous populations, and the enslavement of millions of Americans, or of millions of Africans, who in turn become Americans. Intense attacks against women's autonomy and bodily knowledge in the forms of witch hunts, the Industrial Revolution, and the establishment of the wage system and the rapid concentration of wealth that came with it, growing slave insurrections across the South, urban instability among the working class and poor in the North. At this time, police forces start to emerge in three distinct regions in somewhat distinct ways: the North, the South, and the West of what is now called the US. The closest thing to a form of police in the North was the Night Watch. The earliest record of an established Night Watch was in Boston in 1636. This early predecessor of modern police emerged alongside the fledgling US proletariat that was growing in size and diversity, with a social life and street culture disruptive to capitalist work discipline. The Night Watch had many functions. They looked out for fires, tried to guard against vandalism, and arrested any Black person who couldn't prove that she or he was free. The watch was not professional in any way. All of them had day jobs and rotated into watch duty temporarily, so they didn't patrol regular beats. And everyone hated doing it. The rich bought their way out of it by paying for substitutes. By the time of the Civil War, there is not only working class rebellion in the form of strikes, you also have riots. For example, from 1801 to 1832, Black New Yorkers rioted 4 times to prevent former slaves from being sent back to their out-of-town masters. In the antebellum South, slave patrols haunted the streets, not watchmen. These were basically armed police scouring the countryside day and night, intimidating, terrorizing, and brutalizing enslaved and oppressed people into submission. They not only patrolled plantations, but even the areas where Black slaves were allowed to live during the off seasons to earn some living. They controlled the movement of both enslaved and free Blacks, and policed the social life of communities on and off the plantation. In some ways, they were also used to hunt and attack maroon communities. For example, near Charleston, South Carolina in the 1820s, a more formal police guard emerged in the hunt for 3 Maroons who killed a slave owner. With the Civil War, there was a shift from policing Black folk as a private responsibility of a slave owner to a public responsibility of all white people. In regard to the Manifest Destiny period, as part of westward expansion, incipient police forces like the Texas Rangers will play a vital role in annexing new territory for the United States to subjugate new populations of Mexican and indigenous people. Established in 1823, the Texas Rangers acted as a protection force for white settlers in the Mexican territory, removed Comanche and Cherokee natives from their lands, and as war troops during the so-called Texas Revolution, which resulted in the secession of Texas and the Texas from Mexico, and the Mexican-American War, which resulted in the United States gaining territories of Canada, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and part of Wyoming. Once conquered, the role of police in these states would always be immediately tied to immigration, citizenship status, and the patrol of borderlands. So modern police would emerge with a mandate to control these rebellious crowds and their access to public space, to protect the property of capitalists, and to enforce social divisions such as race and gender in order to prevent rebellion. In addition, we'll start to see how the police force reforms themselves to overcome limitations in crushing rebellions and strikes. They'll transition from simply responding to uprisings as they occur to a strategy of prevention and mass surveillance. Post-emancipation. Centralization continues. In 1880, all major cities had some sort of police department. As opposed to the night watch, they then changed to have only one employer, the state, and make a set salary. They also operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and are trained and regimented. Additionally, their role as strikebreakers is solidified. For example, in New York City alone, there were 5,090 strikes involving 1 million people between the years 1880 and 1900. Furthermore, with regard to racial division, the police were instrumental in maintaining and replacing US apartheid through things like the Black Codes and Jim Crow in the South, which are direct predecessors to today's exploitative prison industrial complex. Centralization of the police from the late 1800s to the mid 1900s runs parallel to the centralization and formalization of the social distinctions in the United States. Millions of Black folks flee the South and become proletarians in northern factories. Latinos, mostly from Mexico or former Mexican lands, join the ranks of the working class in agricultural and industrial sectors. Indigenous folks are mostly subjugated and incarcerated on reservations, and the federal government stabilizes. Gender roles are further solidified. Women's autonomy is severely repressed, and gender and sexuality are heavily policed, both publicly and privately. The growing needs to control these social forces and maintain public order provides the impetus for the centralization and professionalization of the police.
Cool. So I'm Kay, and I'm going to take us through, since V took us up through the whole early history of the police, I'm going to take us into what happens in the middle of the 19th century to get us to the next part, which is what does policing look like today? So first I want to start with kicking off a question, which is what, and y'all can just type in the chat if you want. I know sometimes it's easier. If you want to speak up, that's fine too. But what do you all picture for kind of this period of the mid 1900s, maybe specifically the 1960s? Sometimes they refer to it as the long 60s. So you can share in the chat like anything you're picturing for what the US looks like in the 60s. I see mass movement in the chat. Yeah. Can we get specific? College students. Yeah, college students. I assume college students meaning like college movements on college campuses or movements of young people. We have integration going on, pretty complex police surveillance. Yeah. Free love. I see. Post-war boom, Vietnam War. Yeah, massive anti-war movement, law and order. Yep, anti-communism, super real here. I see hippies. I see psychedelics, lots of drugs. Okay. Black Power movement. Yeah. 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 So it's a time of a lot of social upheaval, right? These mass movements that are going on in the US. We can picture all these things, the civil rights movement, the anti-war stuff, anti-imperialist protests, and much more. And during this period, the unrest here leaves cops in a difficult position because the cops' response to the social movements at the time costs them a lot in terms of public credibility and elite support, like the support of the capitalists, and also officer morale, which hopefully sounds familiar to you because, again, right now we're having a period of poor officer morale where, like, at the Atlanta Police Department, for instance, and many departments around the country are having difficulty retaining cops. Their frequent and very overt use of violence, combined with the covert surveillance they're engaged in, like the FBI's COINTELPRO operations and the infiltration and disruption, these things don't only fail to squash the movements initially, but they also diminish the trust in law enforcement. So what are the police to do? They have to reinvent themselves. And how do they do this? Well, the first place they look to reinvent themselves is for models. The first model they look to is the military. They look at military training, tactics, equipment, weapons. These things start making their way into domestic police departments. At the same time, veterans returning from Vietnam are making their way into police departments. And more subtly, military approaches to organization, deployment, command, control. And police strategists specifically began studying something called counterinsurgency warfare. So what is counterinsurgency? Well, we often hear this referred to as COIN, maybe. And what counterinsurgency refers to is a kind of low intensity or asymmetrical type warfare that's characterized by an emphasis on gathering intelligence, on security and peacekeeping operations, propaganda, and all these efforts to gain the trust of the people. So the cops start to experiment with a kind of softer or more friendly type of law enforcement through doing foot patrols, attending neighborhood meetings, having police-sponsored youth activities, and attending to so-called quality of life issues. Police departments at the same time start to recruit more Black and brown officers in order to so-called reflect the communities that they're policing. And they start to incorporate things like sensitivity trainings of different kinds. And these are a bunch of public relation techniques, right? And they eventually coalesce into an approach that today we call community policing, which is very popular, probably most infamously in places like New York or LA, but it's all around the country now. And we can see one example of this kind of shift that happens at the time in policing here in Atlanta. I say here because I'm in Atlanta. I realize many of you might not be in Atlanta, but this example in Atlanta, at the end of the 1960s, Atlanta, just like many other urban areas, is experiencing rising crime rates and economic decline in the urban core. And Atlanta's political leaders, supported by business leaders, both Black and white, they work together to preserve order and protect capital investment through these like public safety policies that were promoting punitive crime control, such as foot patrols, public decency legislation, the expansion of police powers in low-income urban neighborhoods. And they were stressing orderliness and respectability. And this really prefigures the rise of order maintenance policing, which we commonly hear referred to as broken windows policing today, all over the country. So they basically are going after so-called victimless crimes, like public drunkenness and such. Those are prioritized to make places like more safe or whatever for development, right? So a huge shift happening here. And these are kind of two sides of the same coin. So on the one hand, we have increased militarization, which means stronger and more lethally effective policing. And the community approach means legitimacy because it makes cops seem like problem solvers. So in this way, police are repressing us, while at the same time, they're obscuring their role as an oppressive force. By working with like welfare services, churches, nonprofits, and similar organizations, police are able to really plant themselves into the fabric of neighborhood life and gain access to new sources of information and influence community leaders. And sometimes the police can even use these relationships, right, to channel and control political opposition, moving it into safe and institutional and reformist directions and away from more radical or militant activity. So some examples of that we've seen just in recent years even would be the response in Oakland after Oscar Grant was murdered. The institutionalized left and some of the progressive nonprofits actually collaborated with the police to prevent riots in the wake of that murder. Or in anti-gang raids, like for instance in New York City, this has been huge, where police gather intelligence through social media and then combine it with like stop and frisk street harassment so they can identify who to target for raids and arrests. Here in Atlanta, some examples is it looks like police attending neighborhood meetings or doing coffee with a cop events, having Black police chiefs, at the same time that Atlanta has the most surveillance cameras of any city in the US. And cops are, of course, using chemical weapons on protesters like this summer. So the core lesson from this whole period and the police reform that we get coming out of the 60s is that policing went from repressing revolutionaries, right, then in the 60s and all, to repression of an entire population or entire social groups. So police reform here actually just means more control, not liberation or greater safety for us. And I'll pass it to somebody else who's going to talk about today's force.
Hey y'all, I'm somebody else. I'm Sada. I'm excited to talk to y'all about a little bit about what policing looks like today. So just to get us fast forwarded to this moment in time, posing a question to y'all. What do you think the role of the police is today? Feel free to type it or to unmute yourself. Protect and serve capital, yeah. Political repression, protect capital and uphold white supremacy, evictions, control, enforcing capitalism, social control through violence, social control of Black and brown people. The chat is blowing up, buildings over people, preserving the status quo, tear gassing us, oh shit. So obviously, you know, we have some empathetic people here today who really understand what it looks like. And ultimately, people keep saying maintaining capitalism, maintaining white supremacy over and over again. So what y'all are saying is 100% true. The real main role of policing today is maintaining social order. And they maintain social order by casting a wide net of surveillance and by intimidating entire populations. They do all of this, and what they say is, we're fighting crime. And they expand the category of criminality or of what a criminal is. So Kay touched on this before in their part, but you know, now it's drug use. Now it's deciding that sex work is illegal. Now it's deciding that immigration of certain kinds is illegal, right? So they continue to expand who is criminal. The second way is they repress forms of social life and political activity that they can't firmly route into safe channels. So one of the ways that we might think about this most easily is political activity. Mass mobilizations, strikes, all this political shit. What do they say? You need to go vote. That's all you can do. That's the one way that you can voice sort of your political will. And when you try and do something like a strike, a riot, a major demonstration, they'll cut you off. But it's also even with leisure. They decide how we have our leisure time. They decide how we have our entertainment. All of this is sanctioned by the police. The third way is that the modern police is kind of like a semi-autonomous force within the state. So supposedly we can vote our elected officials out for better or worse, whether or not they pose real changes, we can vote them out, right? Other than some symbolic types of votes, like maybe a sheriff in a county, we're not voting out the police. And even when we vote in a different sheriff, there really aren't major changes that happen with the police. This is why recent calls for defunding and abolishing the police, it's kind of hard to imagine how those would happen through electoral means, because they are separate in many ways from other functioning parts of the state, other electoral politics. So they'll remain intact even if the figureheads of power change. So we're in an era of crisis. I don't know if y'all knew that. You might be experiencing it firsthand, but I think we could very readily say that we're in an era of crisis. We're in an era of social upheaval, of disintegration. And that's kind of similar to what was happening when the police originated, like we were talking about before. So just again, to get us in this mindset, sadly, of crisis, can y'all think of examples of the current crisis that we're in? Again, feel free to type it out or say it out loud. don't like scream for 30 minutes, because you could do that too, because it's really bad right now. What are some of the examples of the current crisis? Pandemic, hell yes. Eviction crisis, yes. Financial crisis. Yeah, it's all of these crises. The climate crisis, absolutely. Climate with double exclamation points. Fascists being labeled as anarchists, yes, happened just a few days ago. The wealth gap, exploitation of labor, Black people being killed, mass incarceration. Yes, we have multiple and overlapping crises, patriarchy definitely being one of them. So as we continue to have these crises, the capitalist state increasingly relies on the police. So in the past, struggles of workers or oppressed people could negotiate certain systemic reforms. They might be like, oh, okay, Black people, y'all are telling us you have no rights. Okay, you can have the right to vote. Increasingly, though, the economic crisis all over the world is getting so much deeper and so much worse because of something called the falling rate of profit, which we could talk about for like 10 hours, but we won't do today. And this causes it to be pretty unlikely and pretty difficult for them to actually give us any structural reforms. And so that means, what do they have to resort to? Violence and intimidation. The police are increasingly used for protests. The police are increasingly used all over the world when people are clashing and demanding more. So we don't just see this in the United States. We see it in Hong Kong, we see it in China, we see it in France, we see it in South Africa, we see it all over the world over and over and over again. And here's the thing. So like all of us here, I can see from the chat, y'all know what's up. Y'all probably aren't the biggest fans of the police either. We're called a world without police, so you know where we're at. But most people, including the cops, even if they understand that some reforms need to happen, they don't understand the explicit purpose of the police as enforcing capitalist social relations. So these relations are taken for granted, and police are developed to address problems that crop up within society, supposed problems. So we talk about the cops addressing crime, but really what they're doing is they're upholding the private property relation. Really what they're doing is upholding exploitation and exploiting themselves. And the claim is, the basis is, we're doing this to protect good people like you from bad people out there. But when they say bad people, when they say dangerous people, we all know what they mean. It's an entirely racist social construct that just upholds white supremacy. When they're saying they're doing something like guarding against, if you remember this inane debate from a few years ago, that's still present, men from women's bathrooms, because they're protecting them. No, they're not. They're actually upholding gender divisions. They are deciding and telling us what gender is, and that they get to enforce the gender relation. So at the same time that they oppress, they oppress, and they are serving particular institutions that oppress, they're obscuring their purpose, and they're making themselves feel like a natural byproduct of human society. So the police are violent in two ways. I mean, they're violent in like 10 million ways, but we could probably break it down into two ways: implicit and explicit. So the explicit way is that, unlike other sections of the capitalist state, police act truly without consequences. We might feel like other sections of the capitalist state do, they do, but the police have carte blanche. So this is really easily seen with the amount of cops that are that like go through a criminal prosecution and then they end up getting discipline. That's something like 2 to 3% of police shootings actually result in discipline. And you might be like, Sada, have you looked up this statistic recently? Has it hopefully changed because we're increasingly talking about the fact that people are being killed by the police and have footage and evidence of it? Sadly, no, this percentage isn't changing at all. And the assumption would be that if they were caught for doing something like that and it was not part of their function, then they would they would face consequences. But it is their function. And police are actually able to define when they're at risk. In the law, they are able to define when they're feeling threatened and at risk. And so they're able to define when they use deadly force to respond. So the basis of the very question itself of when to kill, of when to maim, it's in their hands per the law. And the violence is highly effective because it controls so many aspects of our life, including wild shit like how we walk, how we talk, how we listen to music, how we drive, how we relax. All of those aspects of our lives are controlled by our fear, our very real fear of the police. So the second sense in which they're violent is, as long as cops do their job, everyday exploitation continues. We are in constant fear, even those of us who are here because we want to do shit and change things, we're in constant fear about the police intervening and hurting us and the people that we love if we challenge the systems around us. So if a boss steals your wages and you want to strike or you want to retaliate with your coworkers, you think about the cops coming. If you're dealing with an abusive partner or street harassment and you want to fight back, you're scared as shit because there are examples like Marissa Alexander and Cece McDonald who have spent time in jail and one of whom is still imprisoned because they fought back against their abusers. When you're broke at the grocery store, rather than doing the very sensible thing of taking the eggs so that you can eat them, you don't because you're worried about being taken to jail. If you can't make your rent check, who is there to evict you out of your home and throw your things onto the street? The police. So all of these instances, they're just doing their job. The violence that they inflict upon us, that keeps us from solving our problems. That keeps us from fighting back together and advocating for what we need. And so no matter how nonviolent or representative police forces become, no matter how many women they hire as police chiefs, no matter how many Black and brown people they hire as police chiefs or police officers, it don't matter. Their very function is to protect private property, to protect power, and not to protect us. So no amount of training, no amount of legal oversight, and no amount of reform can alter this fundamental fact that police institutions are violent and they're supposed to be. So I'm going to pass that on to Tranquilo and Justin and let them take it from there.
Hey, Justin, we can't hear you.
Justin, still can't hear you. I think we can hear now. You spoke.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. All right. So back to the question of reform and the goal of abolition. So throughout the course of this presentation, and we've seen the history of reform and how ultimately with how policing has developed, how reform has led to a much more insidious style of policing over time, and how the role of the police is to uphold capitalist exploitation and to continue to drive inequality through state-sanctioned violence against the most vulnerable. Today, again, the question of reform is central to our movement, as the police have always been essentially a performance institution. In light of this history, we review reforming the police in terms of how it's commonly thought about today as harmful rather than helpful. They need to be abolished. Of course, there are no universally good or bad reforms. These reforms are a question of balance of power between us, between social forces, coming into conflict. So us as a community coming into conflict with the state, or us as community coming into conflict with private forces looking to subjugate us. So they are either things that mobilize and grow and act as a springboard to something bigger in regards to reform, or things that stifle us, immobilize us, pacify us. So some police reforms that are purely symbolic and that can be used against us is example cameras on cops. They're intended to be used as a means of accountability for police actions, but seen as that putting static, cops can simply cut their cameras off and cut and edit footage, and the state can control that narrative. Example would be Raziel, and how the footage was used in court against them to further incriminate them. And even reforms like overturning 238G and leaving even on overturning interactions with like bills like 283, common space in which there's law enforcement interaction with ICE. And you would think that this would be a reform that prevents further immigration, but instead, local law enforcement become deputized as immigration officers, essentially doing the role of ICE for them. And so even though that they were supposed to be cutting these ties, they're still imprisoning the undocumented. And this cut of contact is supposed to cut detainers or the amount of immigrants in prisons, but because they were still deputized as immigration officers, the local police in Harris County, they were still essentially imprisoning immigrants and committing state violence. Some other examples would be use of force. Use of force requirements, because that is still requiring officers to properly report and putting the solutions into the state's hands rather than people's hands. However, there are reforms that do have material gains for people, particularly the most marginalized women, color, children, disabled, queer folks, and there's many different ways to implement reform that's like tangible, like removing cops from schools and not relying on police to, yeah, not relying on police to solve problems within schools or conflicts in schools and prisons. Ending street patrols and traffic cops, and finding different ways of community engagement and involvement to increase order, in addition to just outright cutting ties with ICE. So beyond just like cutting detainers, there's no actually like funding, interaction, and the programs that actually get push immigrants into jail, that those funds are taking away. However, reforms will ultimately be useless if we don't take back territory as they retreat territory. So as we remove cops from schools, instead they're replaced with more teachers, social workers, and things of that nature. Fighting towards these ends must be done in a way that fosters an autonomous community activity of oppressed people. So just hollow mobilizations of putting cameras on cops and use of force, nonprofits to provide solutions that takes power away from our hands. So we're putting forward. So ultimately, the goal is to, if we're going to have reform, that we push forward reform campaigns that get cops and the state off, in a way, get cops off our backs for a bit so we can fight more effectively as community, as activists, as power holders, and help build real sustained community power that's autonomous, independent from the state, politicians, nonprofits, and organizations that lie outside our direct control. So yeah.
All right.
So then,
oh, we finished?
Yeah, you got it.
Oh, okay. So basically, what do we mean by abolition, right? Abolition basically is we're going for the complete elimination of policing, right? As a system. And we believe that this also entails revolutionary transformation of society, because under, class society, under societies, under capitalist societies, police will exist. So long as there's exploitation, I mean, you need someone to protect your profits. Like, who else is going to come beat up the workers in the lower class if you don't have police, right? But abolition is not just, something abstract that we think about and that we kind of just impose on the struggle. It comes from actual activity and engaging in struggle and engaging in the streets, at our workplaces and schools and our communities. And just like the police as an institution came about to basically manage class, to manage exploitation, to ensure that the ruling class stays in power. It will take, the vast majority of us struggling to build a new society to get rid of it. And so if we think about struggles over the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, over the last decade, we think about what happened in Baltimore several years back, Ferguson in 2014, Durham. I mean, we can think about this summer, everything that's been happening. We've seen moments of struggle that kind of help expand this conversation, right? When it comes to police violence, racism in the police, abolition, and we also kind of seen the limitations of kind of reform. And so if we think about the rebellions in cities like Baltimore, um, places in North Carolina, Milwaukee, if we think about just all over this country, Chicago, you have people, particularly young people, but going from just looking as spectators to being involved in some sort of action, in some sort of protest, um, to shape history. Using their power to basically try to make some sort of change. Uh, they also began, to assert their own ideas of justice and Black life. And then, we have encampments. We've had occupations and encampments. I mean, particularly up in Minneapolis and also various other cities where people have, occupied squares or burned down police police stations. Was another action that people did, um, and basically began policing themselves. I think of the example in Seattle, where the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, also known as Chaz, where essentially, they had abolished policing to a certain extent within, I think it was like a 5 or 6 block square within downtown Seattle. Um, and of course, they had their own things they had to figure out. They had to, face off first the police imposing themselves, trying to pose themselves back into the autonomous zone, and also right wingers coming there to attack them, and to basically be violent towards them. But that was, an exercise in trying to see a world without police. Community patrols is something that many groups are doing. Um, of course, these patrols, shouldn't become the kind of replacement police, but need to be tied within the community, that kind of teaches like a collective action and community training and self-defense is a part of their patrolling, so we can establish the idea of self-security, right? So we don't have to think about relying on the outside forces of the state all the time, but kind of also seeing ourselves as agents. I think we should also look to historical examples of like various revolutions where they sought to abolish the police. They didn't always do it. They didn't always win, but I mean, think about revolutionary Spain in the 1930s. We can think about, revolutionary Russia in 1917. We can think about now, the Zapatistas, right? And kind of look at the ways in which they formed community defense and the ways they fought back against the police, in their goal of, establishing a just society, not based on inequality, and not based on the authority of the police. And so, all this is amazing, and everything that happened, at least, for our side over the summer was amazing. But these moments always run up against, the limits of, runs up against limits basically. And we're gonna have to kind of overcome and think about the ways forward to push the struggle. And so, moments like these give a lot of relief to anger, inspire others, and also help us fight through the crackdowns by the state. And so, we're hopeful for the potential of uprisings, even against the odds we're faced against, to kind of build lasting structures, and communities and organizations and networks that can fight against the police and even eventually overcome the societal need for police, period.
Okay.
Shaheen, you're muted.
Oh, okay. Now that y'all have a little bit of a history of the policing and what it looks like now, we're going to talk a little bit about strategy and what does a world without police look like. And Tranquilo and Justin have already touched on some of these things, but we're going to sort of, in this section, I'm going to try to give you all some examples of how this has been done in Atlanta specifically. But I would really encourage you all for the bullets that we don't have an example in Atlanta. What might this look like in Atlanta? And we're hoping some of those examples and some of those strategies will come up later on in the discussion section. So we can draw from projects or struggles that are already happening in the cities around the country. And in some cases, these things have been taken up more informally, just through the social connections and practices that exist in some exploited communities. So one strategy is disempower. Is to disempower the cops, to strip away their legitimacy by taking them out of our local institutions, and increasing the number of places where they're not brought in to solve problems, and increasingly isolating them and taking them out of the fabric and networks of our daily life, so they do not have this power over us. And then, if you're going to disempower the police, we have to replace them with something. So disempowering the police necessarily also means empowering ourselves and our communities, however we choose to define what our community is, and to organize ourselves in free and autonomous ways and solve our own problems without the police. So one example of that is, I think this one has already been touched on, which is getting cops out of schools, but also getting them off of university campuses. And we can start with the schools where the cops have a history of abuse. And now I'm thinking of examples over the past few years where we've seen videos of, cops like slamming students in classrooms. Let's start with those schools with the eventual goal of getting cops out of all schools and universities. But also organizing no cop zones, temporary spaces reclaimed by community where police are prohibited from entering. An example of that here in Atlanta, was for a while the Wendy's Autonomous Zone. And, cutting union ties with police. I know that since this summer, there have increasingly been calls to kick out police unions from AFL-CIO. On the job actions, an example of that would be the transit workers strike in Minneapolis after the George Floyd protests, where transit workers refused to transport protesters that were arrested from the protests to the jail. Solidarity networks to fight against stolen wages, to keep roofs over our heads. Rapid response networks that can respond to the threat of immigration or police raids in neighborhoods. A really good example of that is, in Atlanta was Ice Chasers, a project that was started by GLAR, where regular everyday volunteers are trained to be in communities that are targeted, predominantly immigrant communities where Black and Brown folks are targeted by police and by ICE. Another great example of this is Cop Watch, and Cop Watch is for anyone that has been to protests this summer, you all know how invaluable it is to have videos of police brutality against protesters. It is also important to encourage neighbors to refuse to talk to police. Examples of these campaigns are Know Your Rights campaigns that Community Movement Builders does, as well as the Teardown does, because oftentimes the evidence that the police have against people are things that other people they know have said, whether they're meaning to or not. So, the simple rule, do not talk to cops, are just things that people might not even think about or know. Develop mental health and domestic crisis response that does not require calling 911, because they will route that to the police. An example of that is the Georgia Crisis and Access Line. And I think the number is going to be put in the chat. And while these current examples in Georgia, for instance, the crisis line might not be perfect, the groundwork and the infrastructure for some of these strategies are already in place. So how can we develop them more? Stop them from building more power via police stations, recruitment campaigns, and prisons. And an example of that was the resistance to the Zone 3 precinct. And of course, stopping the relationship between ICE and the police, and demanding that Atlanta break their contract with ICE as part of the ACDC campaign. So these are some local examples of how, there have been already like a resistance to increasing the power of the police, or rather, trying to decrease the power that they have in our lives. So I would encourage folks to continue to think on how we can build on these for the discussion section.
Cool. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about disarming. This is the second leg of this strategy. And I think it's important to think about and consider what other public officials carry a utility belt of lethal weapons. Of course, we believe that the police shouldn't exist at all, but until then, there's no reason that all policemen should have guns, let alone high-tech weaponry and military gear. I think about this as a harm reduction strategy, even though police would still be a problem in that, right, we would immediately see a decrease in murders and brutality if we were able to disarm the police. So it's important to fight to shut down programs that sell military equipment to police departments. It's important to launch campaigns to remove police weapons from schools, hospitals, national parks, malls, you name it, eventually, hopefully, leading to disarming the police that are in the streets. We need to campaign against specialized police weapons, tasers, tear gas, cyber surveillance, all that. It's unnecessary and is just used for increasing political repression. Then we also need to really work to expose and denounce the political repression that's coming from police forces. A lot of people aren't even aware that just outside of Atlanta exists the GILLI program. That stands for the Georgia-Israeli Law Enforcement Exchange. Georgia is sending local law enforcement to Israel to be trained in the tactics used in Palestine so that they can sharpen each other's skills for oppression. That's incredibly dangerous for the people in the United States and Israel, or I mean in Palestine. So once we've disarmed the police force, we'll work to disband it. So disbanding the police encompasses a more fundamental abolitionist transformation of society. A common response we get when we talk about police abolition is how we'll deal with crime and antisocial behaviors without the cops. It's the famous, what are we going to do with the rapist question, which is its whole other soapbox that I'm not going to go into today. But what we are arguing is that the cops don't actually help deal with any of these social problems. In fact, they're more likely to be perpetrators of social problems like rape or domestic violence. A good example of this is Daniel Holtzclaw, a cop who was convicted in 2015 for multiple accounts of rape on duty. It's also maybe not commonly known, but police are more than 4 times more likely to be domestic abusers at home. But we also recognize that we have to collectively change the way we address social problems to no longer require the intervention of armed anti-Black bureaucrats. We are all thoroughly shaped by capitalist social relations, which are at their core dehumanizing, alienating, and violent. Through the struggle of disempowering and disarming the police, hopefully we can transform ourselves, how we relate to one another, and in a sense, rebuilding our own sense of humanity. Overall, we have to transform how we think about crime, conflict, and identity. We can break the association between crime and violent punishment, the association between justice and jail cells, and criminality and certain kinds of people. We can expose how crime talk is used to dehumanize Black, Indigenous, non-binary people of color, poor, queer, unruly, and rebellious people. When we don't think in terms of punishment, control, and division, we can begin to imagine what real justice might look like. We have to fight to disband particular police units that are involved in scandals or otherwise politically vulnerable, as what happened to the NYPD Street Crimes Unit that murdered Amadou Diallo in 1999, or what we're currently seeing in Minneapolis right now. We can work to decommission police precincts when they're threatened by funding shortages or demographic changes or challenges by popular protest. We can organize to drive police forces out of specific institutions, and then instead of replacing them with private security, develop community safety teams that are democratically elected and directed by those they protect. A potential model to look to for this is the San Francisco transit system, the BART, beginning to hire social workers instead of the police force in their transit stations. We have to demolish the political power of police unions, including lessening their influence in local governments and ultimately decertifying and disbanding their unions entirely. Once our movement is strong enough, then we can disband police forces entirely in democratic self-governing areas and replace them with systems of community safety and conflict resolution. So I know that that's a lot for you guys to chew on for now. So I think we're going to take a little 5-minute break and come back for some discussion.
I'm gonna open back the music up real quick. 1 second.
That's where it's at. So listen, baby, it's try me. Try me. Try
Maybe we can take a moment to read through some of the questions that were sent into the chat. Or if we want, we could start with the first comment from Richard. I guess I'll read it off for people that are on the cast and can't see the chat. But the question is, or comment is, no question at the moment, just a comment. Y'all's presentation made me think about the events at the Capitol again, ... The narrative shouldn't be about domestic terrorists or rioters against feds. I really like to think of it as a minor family disagreement between two groups that have fundamentally the same positions and hinting at the lack of violence. And yeah, just because I kind of have like an immediate response, I can just respond thinking, and we were a group of us were talking about this just before this call, where the label of terrorism is often like affiliated, and they'll like quote the FBI and the CIA for how terrorism is described, and meanwhile the FBI is very much an entity that's just been used to repress our social movements, from the Black Power movement to the Black Liberation Army, and against the Gay Liberation Front, and also to now in modern day. And we've had, even here in Atlanta, have received repression from the FBI and investigations from GBI and other things into people who were protesting in the George Floyd uprising. So terrorism has become like kind of like this very large blanket term that's pretty inevitably harmful and does not actually state anything for how these protests are a demonstration of how fascism is rising within the white working class. Someone want to take Sarah C's question? Oh, I see. That was responded to in the chat.
I'll just go ahead and read it off for people who are on the webcast. Sarah says, first of all, thank you so much for your organizing and for sharing this presentation. Are there ways in which y'all's organizing has involved harm reduction in the court system, advocating for changes in sentencing, changes in bail, etc.? If not, are there effective reforms you've discussed in this area? Greatly apologize if you have touched on this. I'm taking care of my baby while listening, so I may have missed. And Kay responded a little bit and said, while I think most of us are glad the campaign for cash bail in Atlanta won, I worry that it's disproportionately allowed depending on social positions and is also easily rolled back.
Yeah, to add to that, it's not only that it's like disproportionately applied to certain people, but it's also just like completely ignored by many of the prosecutors who end up deciding, like what kind of bail should be appointed or whatnot for individual cases. Song, the Southerners Underground, was doing some court watching to monitor and like try to quantify the amount of signature bond that was actually being used. And don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but it was it was like less than 15% of people who qualify for signature bond were actually being let out on such grounds. And other forms of harm reduction in regards to bail would be things like the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, where they're getting people out who are currently being held on bail, and through mutual aid funding, we've been able to like get people out earlier, and that's been a large resource for years, but really stepped into a huge new just like a jail support team since the George Floyd uprising.
Another aspect of harm reduction that I would add that doesn't necessarily involve the court system, but involves kind of the larger picture of the carceral state is transition and placement programs for people who are formerly incarcerated and getting out of jail or prison. Notably, Women on the Rise in Atlanta does a lot of work on this, as well as other organizations across the country. And that really helps reduce recidivism because people have a place to go and have a stable place to reintegrate back into society and kind of relearn all of the skills that kind of went stagnant while they were in prison. and find a job and those kinds of things too, and have financial support, because when you're getting out of jail, you literally have nothing. So it's important to have that support for when you get out.
We have a comment from Dan I can read out, and then whoever wants to answer can. I'm curious what other projects might be in representation here regarding this type of work. I work with a project called the Carbondale Spring out of Southern Illinois. This is a municipalist-based project that seeks to defund the police in a city that has more than twice the national average of police, and seeks to allocate that funding toward initiatives of care work, food autonomy, worker cooperatives, and sustainable energy and practices. It seeks to use defunding as a step towards abolition. So whoever wants to field that about any other groups that we have doing this same type of work here. I think I see on Stat K, and I also saw Nolan raising their hand or his hand. So Kay, go ahead, and then Nolan.
Oh, great. Yeah, I would love to hear from Nolan, because I see that Nolan's involved with DARK, which is the local defund group in Atlanta. I was just going to say, in our kind of discussions within a rollout police, we're kind of two minds, it seems, so far. We're on the one hand super excited to hear so many people talking about defunding the police. Just like it's been really exciting to see so many people move away from like reformist positions, or the kind of like, oh, it's just a bad cop, just get rid of the one bad cop, the bad apple line. So that's been really exciting. On the other hand, I kind of worry that if we don't, like, I love, Dan, your comment, and really inserting a lot of like content into what it would look like to reallocate those funds, and who those funds are going to, and what kinds of things we want to build up. Because I worry that defund is in some corners getting a little watered down to mean defund the police and then fund existing mental health services or something, which a lot of the existing mental health services are super carceral by their very nature, right? Or super oppressive by their very nature. And so just because we have something that, I don't know, isn't police, doesn't mean that it's not also something we want to get rid of, But I love Dan's comment, because it seems like, Dan, you're talking about building up stuff that people can actually like have control over and help to shape, like these mutual aid projects and such. So I'd love to see more of those kind of things being pushed in Atlanta, as opposed to like asking city council to defund the police and move the funds, because they're going to move it to where they want to move it to. And those things aren't necessarily good for us, because a lot of the existing services aren't good for us. And it's not because they have a lack of funding necessarily, but it's often because of the kind of like internal philosophy of those structures or institutions that currently exist. And the one thing, and then I'll pass it over to Nolan to hear about DARK, but the one thing I want to add is that I think it's good to be careful too, to not think about like, we gotta get rid of police and then replace them, because like the presentation says, they're not doing any of this shit anyway. In fact, they're actively harming us. They're not doing any good in our society. They're only harming us. So we're not serving to replace them. And it's not like a defund them first or abolish them first and then get the stuff that we need to survive and thrive. Like, no, already every day, people all around the country and the world are building up alternative institutions that aren't to replace police, but it's just what we need to survive, right? Whether that's transformative justice or restorative justice, or things that we don't use big fancy words for, like intervening when we know our neighbors are in a domestic dispute, and helping people out as needed, mediating and making sure that people are safe and protected and cared for. And we do that stuff all the time already, and we need to generalize that, and we need to formalize it as needed so people can learn those skills and pass those skills on, and so on and so forth. So I feel that's generally kind of where we're at as a group, is we're interested in doing those things that builds up our capacity to run our own lives, as opposed to asking the city to do something. Though at times we might also engage in some of this kind of reform work that helps us build our capacity, if that makes sense. But go ahead, Nolan. I kind of talked for a minute.
No, thank you for talking for a minute. Everything that you just said, like, so on the question of what other work's going on here in Atlanta, so DARK is defund APD, refund communities, and I, along with like, I think about 40 other people now, are actively organizing various campaigns around defunding the police here in Atlanta. And they actually asked me to, I was already coming to this, and then they were like, hey, if the opportunity arises, like share a little bit about DARK and make sure they know like what we're doing and how we can collaborate and things like that. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that. We're working on several different things right now, but basically really trying to, more than anything, like find our lane and make sure we know how to collaborate best around the city with groups like yours, of course, with several other groups that you all have already mentioned. We're a part of the Democratic Socialists. We're like an organization built out of the DSA here in Atlanta. One thing that I do want to share that they specifically asked me to share that we're working on as a resource for like all organizing groups here in Atlanta is we're working on a dreaming activity, kind of starting on the theory of like capitalism just generally, more broadly, like robs us of our ability to like dream of what like a collectivist community society can look like, and how we can take care of one another and intervene on one another's behalf and things like that. So we're working on a dreaming activity right now, kind of coding a almost like a game where you're pulling the 200 in 10 million. So you've got the police budget of 220 million in Atlanta. And what we're doing is we're creating a spot on our website where you can go and pull money in tens of millions to 7 different broad categories of like just like actual helpful things for our communities. And then it's going to like collect data that we'll all be able to use as organizers for like what our communities are actually wanting. And we'll really be able to help show like things that why we just don't need police. So that was something that they asked me to share with you all that we're working on. So
I think Falcon, you're next on stack.
Yeah, so I think I think Kay has already touched on this a little bit, and I see someone posted in the chat that replacing police officers with social workers hard pass, and I just kind of want to add to that. We were told to be careful talking about our educational backgrounds, so I won't give specifics, but these issues are not independent, right? They're interrelated, and all of these institutions of social work, mental health, and the police state are connected, which is to control the population. And none of this to say that all of mental illness is a social construction, but those categories are socially constructed, and the dominant theme in all of them is to pathologize people and therefore control them, right? Like the entire like DSM is for thinking of problems in living at an individual level and giving an individual level diagnoses that then needs to be treated at the individual level. And again, not saying that like maybe some of that is not needed, but when you think about most problems in living, there are very like structural issues to it. Like right now, I personally think everyone probably could benefit from therapy, but if someone lost their job and they're depressed, probably what they need more than therapy is a freaking job, right? So, I also want to get rid of labor, wage labor, but what they need is like having their basic needs met. So yeah, I think it's important to keep that in mind, that when we talk about, at least for me, when I think about police abolition, that cannot be something that we can accomplish while keeping all the remaining structures, including the ones that we maybe currently go to for help, the same, because the same theme of controlling people and maintaining the current social order exists in all of them, including our health systems, our mental health systems, social work, and our education systems. Schools absolutely replicate inequities. So, even when we talk about taking money away from the police and putting it in our schools instead, okay, but not if it's just replicating disparities that already exist.
Tranquilo, you said me. Does that mean you want to be on stack?
Oh, no.
Okay, just checking. We just got a question from Eliza in the chat. How do y'all see the work of police abolition and prison abolition intersecting? How can we build movements to address defunding towards abolishing both of these carceral institutions that hold each other up? To kind of start on that one, and other people can feel free to jump in on that topic too. First of all, like knowing that the development of both have like a very like long history, you know, as like for example, how we went into its connection to slavery. It was also used during westward expansion. Prisons were built to detain indigenous people out there, and it also has like a very in-depth like history and like how those prisons were used to like learn some of the agricultural practices that indigenous people had in those parts of the world by like having those prison gardens, you know, and on their connection now, it's well, actually Sara and Kez on sec. Oh, I'll stop. Y'all can talk too. Sara, you got it.
I didn't. That was not intended to cut you off. Do you want
That's
to
okay.
finish what you're saying? Okay.
If there's more to chime in, then I'll jump back in.
Okay. Yeah, the only reason I got on Stack was the first campaign that A World Without Police worked on in Atlanta was doing just that, Eliza. So it was connecting prison abolition and police abolition through abolishing the downtown jail, Atlanta City Detention Center. And we oftentimes see like, so there was that coordinated campaign that we talked about before. It seemed like Mayor Bottoms was like, yeah, we're going to stop the multi-million-dollar agreement with ICE and no longer house immigrants here. And that was a win. And then it seemed like they were actually going to shut down the jail, and that was a win. And then just recently they're like, or maybe we'll sell it to Fulton. So that might not have succeeded, sadly. But the idea was that immediately, even though we're a group of police abolitionists, that means abolishing jails and prisons because one does not exist without the other. And the more that we've seen Atlanta gentrified and policed is the more we've seen the desire for jails and prisons to stay full. And one of the campaigns that we're recently sort of thinking towards as well is a precinct that is opening up soon on the south side of Atlanta. And there's a recognition there that part of the reason why the precinct is opening is to more heavily gentrify that area. South Atlanta is like a new spot. They've taken over the west side, they've taken over the east side, so why not finish off the south side? And as they do that, they're going to be getting people for minor infractions. They're going to be getting people for like a busted taillight or like your registration is slightly off or any of these things. And so where are they going to put them? In jails? People already have records. Where are they going to end up? In prisons. So I think the conversation is immediate, and police and prison and jail abolitionists should view the work honestly interchangeably. And Kels, if you wanted to say something, Kez.
Oh, yes, I was muted, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say with police and prison abolition, I think you can look at them interchangeably. I don't necessarily think that you have to, and I think that they are inseparable either way. And one other sort of struggle that intersects with prison abolition that we haven't mentioned quite yet is kind of labor labor rights. And the police would not need to fill prisons if prisons weren't so beneficial for capitalists to be able to exploit human labor. And so I just thought that that was important to mention and think about in regard to Brad's comment about realizing how much everything else needs to change in relation with police and prison, including healthcare and education disparities. And then the other thing I wanted to mention in regards to healthcare and education and even police and labor is how easily the state can co-opt people's natural desire to do good work, to help people who are struggling with mental health, to spread education among children, to get kids off the streets and into better, after school activities or whatever the thing is. That becomes co-opted and is used kind of against the public and is used as a veil to really hide what's underlying with this such a toxic structure.
So I'll jump in. It's my personal belief, and I believe the belief of this group as well, that the work of abolishing the police and the abolition of the prison industrial complex should be, if not parallel, then it should be hand in hand. And that wherever there are exploitative or oppressive institutions, they should be hounded by the call for abolition.
So we're hoping to end today at 6, just to respect everyone's time. We've been going for a while, but we actually had some questions we kind of want to pose to y'all, because so far it's been kind of y'all bringing comments or questions and us kind of responding, but we want to open it up to have a more kind of free-form discussion and really hear from y'all, because we don't have all the answers at all. Like, we're figuring it out. We've done a number of things. We've learned a number of lessons, and we're all pushing forward, and we have to do that together, So I'll pose the first question and we can have some open discussion. I'll pass it over to B, who can pose the next question. First, I'm just curious, we've brought up some spaces where we see carcerality in our society. Carcerality just meaning like incarceration, right? Ways in which people are incarcerated or surveilled or controlled. And we're curious to hear from y'all of other places in society where you see this kind of carcerality besides police and besides just like jails and prison. So Stack is open. If anyone wants to chime in and like talk, feel free, just type Stack in the chat and I'll call on you. Or you can use the raise hand function if that's clear at all how to use that. I know it's hard to navigate. Yeah, Brad, the question is where else do we see carcerality in our society? Like forms of incarceration, of control, of surveillance, besides police and prison. I see Bradley in the chat saying in the school system.
And you have HOA in the chat too.
Oh, HOA, that's so real.
So that's a homeowners association, right?
Yeah. Work. Yeah. Hey, Dan, I'm curious if you want to expand more on what you mean by that.
Just the constant surveillance of what you have, like over your expectations to produce in whatever context that is. Having to meet those quotas, that time requirement and commitment. I think like working from home during the pandemic for a lot of people implemented that more than what an in-person experience was like previously. So.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks. And then I was also picturing like really often, I feel like it's like a movie clip, but also I know people it's happened to when they get fired, the employer, the boss actually has like a security guard, assist them out of the building or whatever. You're like, oh my gosh. I'm also seeing hospitals, behavioral health hospitals. Yeah, I pictured like this, especially the state-run behavioral health institutions, which are basically just jails. Security cameras all over downtown. Yeah, Eliza. Detention at school. Yep. Cameras in neighborhoods, at transit stations, grocery stores. Also, what we use work email for. Yeah, I can't talk politics at work. That's true. School itself, so carceral. Yeah. One thing I'm seeing missing from this list too, to really expand how we think about this, I'm seeing warehouses. Yeah, is like nursing homes and lots of like old folks facilities and retirement homes that actually put the shit on lockdown and control whether or not people are able to like come and go freely. And this happens also for people who are living with disabilities who get their agency taken away by the state and are forced to live in places where they don't want to be living and their movements are controlled. Yeah, homeless shelters. Yeah. Yeah, domestic violence shelters. Yeah, Juanes, I see in the chat. Personal romantic relationships, like in our society via things like the average rom-coms, how they normalize grand ass forms of surveillance and possession. Yeah. Check in, check out logging hours for work at the production plant. Trespassing on occupied buildings. Oh my gosh, just like fences around parks, fences around everything. All right, this is getting really depressing. I'm not gonna lie. Like, yeah, everything's carceral, it turns out. But it's great, right? Because this is helping us draw the connection between it's not just like police and prisons, but like it's built into the very fabric of our society. This kind of carcerality and control, surveillance, constant, and it's actually like shaping every aspect of our lives. Everywhere that we go, there's some kind of carcerality. All right, B, do you have a question for folks?
Yeah. So the question I'm going to tackle is the question of police PR, and we briefly went over it in the larger discussion. The classic example that I'm sure most of us are aware of is the police-sponsored youth activities. So my question that I'm going to pose to the group is, what were examples of police PR that you were exposed to or that you are aware of, and how do you fight against that police PR on your own on an intellectual level? And once again, feel free to respond in chat, but I would love to hear some of your voices. Brad, I believe we have a stack. You want to speak up? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think, just the events of this week is a pretty good PR campaign for police. I think what we're going to see, right, is the liberal response of, increasing law enforcement to try to prevent this kind of situation from happening again, although the underlying forces, the causes of the event was, more from the divisive political rhetoric rather than, the type of protection that there was at the Capitol.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Brad. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, actually, I want to add in there Hollywood too. I remember for a long time, there still are, police, cop TV shows, Law and Order, CSI, and blah blah blah. This entertainment for us to watch, the justice system and kind of turning it into. It is still part of our lives. It's also part of our entertainment.
Exactly. Propaganda, I think, is a term that just got coined in the chat. That kind of modern myth making that we are all exposed to from the time we're children, assumably until the time that we go somewhere else. Anyone else want to jump in on this police PR? Your experiences with it, either lived or noted, and how you fight against that police PR on your own on an intellectual level.
I think someone had typed this actually before during the thing, but someone said like giving out toys or something, or it was something like that. And I saw that recently in my neighborhood too, the neighborhood cops giving out toys. And it's the most terrifying and infuriating thing. And I feel like it's actually really important to be like, Oh, I actually don't feel safe sending my kids there and saying that and normalizing that. But sorry, I saw Carolyn was on stack.
Take care. Feel free to speak up whenever you get set.
You still there, Carolyn? Oh, there you go. We can't seem to hear you.
Yeah, I think they kept trying and they were saying maybe like to move on and maybe we could come back to Carolyn after Oneness. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I was just gonna add to your point, Sarah, on also like this after the summer, after the George Floyd uprising, there was a moment of like PR nonsense with here in Atlanta where like Tyler Perry had given a bunch of money to APD for APD to like give out groceries and like I think like Amazon gift cards and like Kroger gift cards, something along those lines. And then there was another example too. Oh, and then like the same kind of like this upper class like bourgeoisie like sellouts like T.I. and Killer Mike like also like telling people to like oh we should be collaborating with the police and look like the police like finding these people who are down to keep their name as king of the South or whatever to like end up just I don't know selling other people and like selling and like what would you say it as like just toning down the movement, I guess.
Carolyn, how's it looking for you? No? Okay.
I think Eliza has got it next.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say I was so offended one time. I ran into a Starbucks, which is not usually where I get my coffee, but in Arizona when I was there, and they were doing a coffee with a cop program. And not only were the cops just like inside there to talk to the community, but they were the ones serving the drinks. They were like the baristas behind the counter. And I like went up and I asked them like, why are you here and what are you doing? And they were talking about how they wanted to build this, community relationship. And I left. I was like, I'm not getting anything. And I stood outside and I was like, just trying to let people know, like, just, it's going to be a cop who's making your cappuccino in there. It was like, yeah, very, very offensive.
Thank you for sharing. Kay, I'm gonna throw it back to you. You got another question you want to pose to the group?
I saw one more person on stack, which is Nolan.
We do, okay.
I'll keep it quick. I work with a few different like recovery orgs who do like drug and alcohol recovery. And one of the orgs I work with just stopped it this year, but they used to do like this program where people who were formerly incarcerated and ended up getting out to receive treatment for their addiction instead of punishment for it would do these like lunches with cops so that they would like not be afraid of like the carceral system anymore. And luckily this year, just through some like internal organizing, that got shut down, but it's just another example of it.
Thank you for sharing. So I believe it's about time to wrap it up. Who do we have on stack to close us out?
I think we actually had Brandon on stack, if that's correct. And then I see Uzma and then Bradley, and then Uzma, and then we'll pass it to Lex to close us out.
Do I go? Or
yeah, you got it.
Okay, cool. I was just responding to I just wanted to respond to the question posed about police PR. I think we probably mentioned, sorry about that. We mentioned like police PR in schools. One example that I can remember as a kid was the DARE program, as well as like having like cops come and visit, like hand out toys and stuff. And it's really kind of messed up to think about it now as an adult, now that I am more aware of the school to prison pipeline and just how insidious that can be. And that's all.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to let everyone know before we wrap up that tomorrow Atlanta City Council has a public safety committee meeting. And today is 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. is the time to actually call them in and leave a message. And there's basically 3 major things that we'd like you to leave a message about, which is no more police chases, closing down ACDC, the detention center that we previously just talked about, as well as, well, the charges that were already dropped for peaceful protesters that were arrested. However, just like ask them to stop fucking arresting people for peaceful protesting. And I see Nolan already put all the information in the chat box. So, and you guys have 1 hour left. And that is it.
Cool. Quick thing also before we close out, sorry, Lex, was to add that on January 13th, on Wednesday, there's a call to action for Housing Justice League for, it's going to be a protest to try to push off the ending of the eviction moratorium. And just, you know, they have some language on like how every eviction is going to be violent, and it's definitely connected to policing, as police are going to be doing those evictions themselves. So yeah, it's going to be this Wednesday. I think it's like in the morning. It's at 10 a.m. So if y'all have that time.
And thank you everyone, y'all. We really appreciate y'all for coming out today. And actually, we're really interested in y'all coming to work with us. So again, our organizing training is going to be Monday, January 24th. So that's 2 Mondays from now. And then we're going to put up a flyer. So just like y'all saw this flyer, you're going to have a flyer with the details that's going to include the time and the Zoom link. So once again, we appreciate y'all so much, and we look forward to working with y'all.
Thanks everyone. Well, that's a wrap. Yeah.
Y'all are tight.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for the discussion. Thanks for the questions and insight.
Hey, how can we like stay connected with y'all? I know Dark will want to like promote the organizer training and stuff like that. How can we like stay connected with y'all on that stuff?
I was going to suggest if anyone wants to figure out how to get more closely connected ASAP, then I can stay on for 5 minutes. I bet a couple more people can stay on for 5 minutes, if not it's still, to talk about that. And then obviously, like Agave said, we have that meeting in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Cool. Inspiring collaboration, y'all. That's great.
Thank you all so much.